Beautiful. All right, so first up, Bitcoin currently hovering back around that 111K mark, which ain't too bad for an asset that bottomed under 20K not long ago, but still a long way from that magical $1 million per coin mark that everyone just won't shut up about. So when do we actually get there is the question, right? Well, most forecasts cluster around the same timeline in that 2030 to 2035 range. Bitwise is the loudest and boldest, projecting 1.3 million by 2035 based on a 28% compound annual growth rate. Numbers that make stocks, bonds, and gold look like savings accounts. Meanwhile, Swan Bitcoin says 1 million could land as early as 2030. But a panel of 24 experts are split. Some say 250K by the end of this year. Others already eye seven figures by the end of the decade. Even Eric Trump is confidently predicting $1 million, while Anthony Scaramucci warns a 40% correction could slam Bitcoin before it ever gets to 500K. So, yeah, consensus is bullish, but not without caveats. Here's what's fueling the fire. Institutional demand remains relentless. In mid-2025 alone, $219 million poured into Bitcoin ETFs in a single week. Corporations are hoarding coins too. Less than 15% of the supply is left on exchanges. That's the lowest since 2018. The U.S. government created a strategic Bitcoin reserve this year, putting Bitcoin in the same basket as gold and oil. Policy has eased as well. The SEC loosened the leash on Bitcoin ETFs. Banks and pensions are buying in, and regulators have stopped treating every crypto transaction like a crime scene. So, supply is tightening, demand is growing, and the world's largest economy is stockpiling Bitcoin like a strategic resource. Now, let's do the math. For Bitcoin to hit $1 million, market cap needs to clear $21 trillion. Sounds insane until you remember gold is worth over $15 trillion and global equities top $100 trillion. Timeline-wise, analysts expect consolidation in the 200 to 300K range by 2027, thanks to the next halving squeezing the supply. Now, from 2028 to 2030, institutional inflows and adoption curves could push it toward that 500K mark or even 1 million if momentum accelerates. And by 2035, the consensus is pretty solid. Bitcoin at or above seven figures isn't fantasy, it's probability. All right, we're bringing back Joe. Joe! Most forecasts put Bitcoin at $1 million somewhere between 2030 and 2035. Do you think that that's a realistic timeline, or are analysts just playing it safe by pushing the target far enough out that nobody can call them wrong today? What do you think?
It's a good question. I definitely think that $1 million by 2030 or 2035 for, per individual Bitcoin is certainly reasonable. I also think it could happen significantly faster than that if global adoption accelerates like it certainly could. And I think that's kind of, the quote unquote problem with Bitcoin is like Bitcoin is now a, $110,000, $111,000 asset. Like you mentioned, Bitcoin gold parity would be maybe $1 million per Bitcoin, which, there's not really a super valid reason as to why that couldn't happen incredibly fast. Additionally, I know like Peter Thiel has presented at a Bitcoin conference in the past where he showed that in 1980, global equities actually matched the total value of gold in the world. And so kind of like you pointed out, if Bitcoin becomes the equivalent of global equities, then Bitcoin is worth significantly more than $1 million per Bitcoin. And arguably, Bitcoin's better than gold. It's not just digital gold, the same way that the iPhone is not just Alexander Graham Bell's original telephone. The iPhone is significantly more valuable than Alexander Graham Bell's original telephone. I think Bitcoin is the same way. And so Bitcoin is long-term savings technology. It could go to $1 million incredibly fast. It could also take another 5 to 10 years. I don't know. But because it might, and there's a valid case for it to be made that Bitcoin might go to $1 million really fast, you probably don't want to be trying to time the market or be out of Bitcoin the moment it decides to go on another parabolic bull run, which obviously if you look at Bitcoin's history, it's done so countless times over and over again, and it might just be a matter of time before it does it once again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've heard that tale before. With terms of Bitcoin's price, it's kind of a gradually and then suddenly type of thing. We just don't know when suddenly is going to happen. And when suddenly does happen, right, to that million, it could just be a 10% jump. But if you're at in the 900K level at that point, that Omega candle seems a lot more plausible, like Samson Mao's always talking about that day we get like $100,000 in a quick jump, which will also be known at that point as the best day of my adult life. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot of factors at play, but we're seeing how it's all going to play out per se, but 100 million certainly seems to be the writing on the wall right now. Now, Swan Bitcoin, they lean on something called Metcalfe's law, which basically is the more people join, the more valuable it gets. That's the math. Do you think network effects alone can get us to 1 million, or is that a little too simplistic?
I think that's a great way to think about it. I mean, if you think about what money is in general, is money is a network tool where if you owned all of a specific currency in the world, then that money is arguably pretty useless. Whether that's dollars, gold, silver, salt, glass beads, Bitcoin, whatever form of money you pick out, arguably that's, why Bitcoin, has values because it's a network good that becomes more valuable the more people that adopt it. And adoption tends to happen in waves and in aggressive periods of time where a large portion of the world, relative to the portion that currently holds Bitcoin, decides to adopt Bitcoin. Maybe that's the price is going up. Maybe it's BlackRock launched an ETF. Maybe it's treasury companies are, creating demand and educating the world about why Bitcoin is important. And so adoption happens, more people hold this new form of money, and that's a good way to judge like how fast and how valuable Bitcoin is growing and scaling and becoming the, new foundation of today's financial system.
And aside from just more people getting in makes it more valuable, there's also, of course, a lot of interesting factors at play that seem to be a little unique to this year. I mean, institutional demand is absolutely insane, higher than we've ever seen it. ETFs are pulling in billions. Corporations are hoarding coins. You know all about that. Even the US is building a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So my question is, does that supply squeeze actually accelerate the road to 7 figures? Because we've seen that this year, but with all of this bullish news, we haven't really seen what I would consider to be like parabolic gains to accompany what has been an amazing year for Bitcoin. Why do you think that is? Why haven't things been accelerating maybe the way we would have expected given all of this bullish narratives around 2025?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the answer probably has to do with really in the grand scheme of like monetary history and monetary adoption, how fast Bitcoin adoption has been occurring over the last 16 years or so, right? Like there are fairly regular individual people that, are sitting on billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin or hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. And so when Bitcoin's price, has, over the last 3 years has gone from 16,000 to, 100 and something thousand dollars today, like there are regular normal people that have significant amount of Bitcoin that are diversifying, that are buying that, house that they always wanted, buying a plane that they always wanted, right? And so it's very reasonable for these coins that have been held for a decent amount of time by early adopters to release those coins into the market, which then get acquired by BlackRock, MicroStrategy, or now Strategy, or Similar Scientific, or others, or just individual people that are out there stacking Sats on a daily basis. And it's completely reasonable for these coins to move from these older hands to these newer hands. And I think at a certain point, the supply does happen to dry up, like it has occurred countless times throughout Bitcoin's history. And then the price rips higher, and then the price ripping higher, encourages more people to learn about Bitcoin. They find out it's a better form of money, then they buy some themselves. And then there's less sellers in the market potentially as the price ripped higher, and early adopters had sold all of the Bitcoin that they wanted to sell. And so I think it's just like the natural process of monetary adoption when it's really been happening at, it might feel slow at certain times, but I think over the grand scheme of history, this is like an incredibly unique situation where we're monetizing this new digital form of money from zero, and now it's a $2+ trillion asset class in only 16 years with no marketing department, no executive team, no management team, no employees. Like this is a pretty unique phenomenon that's occurring. And yeah, like in the short term, it can seem like it's taking a while, but I think in the grand scheme of things, this is happening really fast.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's a lot of these old hands that have been in the game for a while. They've bided their time and they're ready to cash out. Like it's been 15, 16 years for some of these guys. And what's another $1 billion if you're an individual, right? You get the Galaxy Digital cash out for like, was it 80,000 coins a couple of weeks ago? We had a more recent one that was like 30,000. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, there are people, though, right now that while they believe it's going to go to these big 7-digit numbers, you got guys like the Mooch. He thinks it's going places, obviously. I think he said like 70% of his wealth, I think, is in Bitcoin. But he warns of a possible 40% crash before we ever even hit 500K. Do you think these brutal drawdowns are still part of kind of Bitcoin's charm, if you will? Or are we kind of moving past this point where because of all of this institutional money, because of these positive narratives going on with Bitcoin, where we might not see those massive drawbacks like we've seen in the past? Or do you think those are very much still in play during Bitcoin's, quote unquote cycles?
Yeah, this is an interesting debate that I've seen a lot of people talking about recently. I think I tend to lean that we will still continue to see a volatile Bitcoin price. Like, I think we're kind of at the point in the life cycle of the dollar that it's fairly fragile. And, as we saw with, the '08 financial crisis, COVID, the tariffs that we had earlier this year, like things can get really wacky really fast. And that's going to affect Bitcoin. The dollar can experience periods of time where all of a sudden credit is contracting and everyone needs dollars really fast. And it can also experience periods of time where the dollar is very abundant, credit is very abundant. You can borrow money and buy real estate, assets, Bitcoin, so on and so forth. And so I think the inherent nature of a debt-based monetary system, which is the dollar today, is inherently fragile. And I think Bitcoin is kind of the opposite of that. And we're seeing global Bitcoin adoption. But because the dollar is so fragile and that kind of our global economy at this point is kind of fairly fragile, it's still reasonable in my mind to see, a volatile Bitcoin price in the future. On top of that, I think, the Bitcoin Treasury Company phenomenon is interesting. And I'll particularly talk about strategy here, where they tried to maintain like an appropriate leverage ratio relative to the Bitcoin on their balance sheet, which basically means as the Bitcoin price goes up, they actually need to buy more and more Bitcoin by issuing credit via preferred equity and buying more Bitcoin. And so that kind of becomes a, reflexive feedback loop, where it's like, okay, if the Bitcoin price goes up, to maintain their similar leverage ratio, they have to issue more credit, buy more Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin price keeps going up, then they have to keep doing that. Bitcoin's price goes down, then they might issue equity and kind of deleverage their balance sheet. And so there's kind of like a positive feedback loop of, as the price goes higher, these companies that are leveraged Bitcoin equities are kind of positioned to maintain their leverage ratio, which could just funnel the Bitcoin price higher and higher. So I think once it really gets going, it has the potential to be like another parabolic bull run. But in the short term, it can certainly fall down, 40% or even more.